Hi, we return to Act 6 today after the community has responded to the word they received that the Hellenistic widows, those Greek-speaking widows, have been neglected in the daily ministry. And one of the key elements we saw last time is that traditional reading, as presented in translations like the New RSV on the left side of the screen and the verses just above the ones you see now, presented as the daily distribution of food. But the word food is not in the Greek, and as we looked at last video, a better reading of it, I think, from recent scholarship is the issue is distribution of resources flowing from the sharing of resources we saw at the end of chapter 4. And as we'll see today, that interpretation will make sense out of the argument that we'll see today between representatives of the Synagogue of the Freedmen and Stephen, which the food element would not have made sense of. Before we get into that, let's look just for a moment at the issues you see on the right side of the screen that I went over in the introductory video to this unit of Acts 6 and 7. Today, we're on number 5 and 6. What exactly are Stephen and the others appointed to do? I related that question a little bit last time, but we'll continue now. But key here is, what is the Synagogue of the Freedmen in 6:9 that you can see on the left side of the screen, and why might they be opposing Stephen? And that's going to be one of the key elements that highlights the interpretation of the tables we saw, not as tables to eat at, but as the banking tables, as we heard Jesus overturn when he came into Jerusalem, claiming that the house of God was supposed to be a house of prayer, but they've turned it into a den of thieves, which is to say the economic activity there is not bad because it's economic activity, but because it's abusive, it's corrupt in some way. And the implication that we'll see here is that the Synagogue of the Freedmen are conspiring, in the most literal sense, of working together with the representatives of the temple to profit off that system. And that's what the threat is, that the apostles have set up now, an alternative banking system, that among the community of Jesus followers, they can distribute resources without the benefit of the temple or the benefit of the freedmen, as we'll see. So that's the central issue here. So as we look back at our chapter, we saw the chiasm that set up the first 7 verses, but there's no real shape nor key words in the second part. But the phrase, the wisdom and the spirit, echoes that all of them were selected for being full of spirit and wisdom. So that's what's happening here. So they're not just resisting Stephen, they're resisting the spirit at the same time. And there's all kinds of irony here, as I've been noting throughout Acts. This is meant to be a funny book. Sometimes it's slap your knee funny or laugh out loud funny. Here it's darkly, ironically funny, as people break the Ten Commandments by you setting up false witnesses in claiming that Stephen is saying bad things about Moses and the law. So we'll see how those ironies work as we go. So let's just jump right into our scene in verse 8, and then we'll look more closely at who the freedmen and the representatives of the synagogue are. So as my note below has, the description of Stephen is positive indeed, but it doesn't match the assignment for which he was chosen, at least so far, in terms of doing signs and wonders. He was meant to be one of those people facilitating that the Greek-speaking widows got their share of what they needed. But signs and wonders, as we see here from this note, is an expression of what accompanies the Spirit throughout. So we saw it back in chapter 2 in the Pentecost scene, we saw it in chapter 4 and chapter 5, and then we'll see it more as we go. So the specific signs and wonders aren't noted, but it's to suggest that being filled with the Spirit, people have power to do things that are effective in changing people's lives. So full of grace and power here, collectively from those 3 verses, we see that he's full of wisdom, Holy Spirit, faith, grace, and power. That ought to equip him for whatever he faces, although, as you probably already know, by the end of the next chapter, he's going to be dead. Power, dunamin, we see a number of times here, in fulfillment of 1:8, where the risen Jesus promised they would be given power from on high, and so now they have that. And now we get to this opposition. And amongst the opponents, they are divided as well. It's important to note that some of this who belong to this synagogue. And every word here is key to understand what's going on. So the some isn't a key word. It's just an ordinary word to highlight there's a division. Synagogue has led historically scholars to argue about whether there were actually synagogue buildings at the time, and there's no archaeological evidence of synagogues in Jerusalem or in this area at the time, but it really doesn't matter. The point isn't whether it's a physical building. The point is that it's a description of members of the people of God gathered together, and that's what literally the word means, synagogos, to gather together. This is the first of 19 times in Acts. And my note below has various evidence about synagogue buildings, but I think we can just skip that over because it ultimately doesn't matter. The question is more who these people are, whether they're gathered in a building or not. The only reason it matters is whether they have a home in Jerusalem or whether these are people who've come like the pilgrims who came at Pentecost from these various places we saw there simply for the feast. But the suggestion, as we'll see, is otherwise, although the text isn't 100% clear. So let's look at Freedman here. The word translated Freedman is as a Greek transliteration of the Latin libertinon here. And it's only here in the Bible, and it's only once in other Greek texts. In Live, in a Latin text, it's used there in the transliteration. So it's highlighting both the multicultural aspect of the reality, and as Fitzmyer suggests, that the fact that it's in Latin here is suggesting these are Jews formerly living in Italy who had settled in Jerusalem, which would make them Hellenists. Keener notes that as freedmen, they're former Roman slaves, and we'll talk more about that in just a minute, who immigrated to the Holy Land from the various regions mentioned in Acts 6-9. But notice how that's inconsistent with what we'll see of the question of whether they were in Italy or not. And that's what he says here, citing below. He cites Philo for the common knowledge that, quote, most of the Jewish community on the other side of the Tiber, which of course is the river that runs through Rome, were descended from captives who had been freed and who maintained their observances. As Keener continues, he says, freed persons remained a distinct group. They received lower seating in banquets and could not marry higher class women, could not serve in Roman legions, which is to say they're lower class compared to the elite in Rome. But they are still Romans in that sense, and whether they're citizens or not is another question. They can be, but as Harrison Mills raises the key point, it was the slaves and freedmen of the aristocracy who acted as the elite's agents and bankers, and therefore handled all their day-to-day financial activities. And we saw throughout Luke how wealthy people often had slaves working for them, not just doing what we might think of slave labor, working out in the fields and doing hard labor, but providing hospitality. And certainly that would have been true in American slave holding too, the so-called house slaves and the field slaves. And the house slaves would be often literate and dressed nicely to make a nice appearance for the wealthy people's guests. And so in this sense, freedmen, former slaves, are working on behalf of the Romans, doing work that's considered beneath the dignity of the aristocracy, which is handling all these resources. And that's one of the key issues that we're going to explore here. And then let's look a little bit more at the details. So there are from 4 places, and let's put the map up as we see it. Just looking briefly, we see Cyrene here in what's now Libya, but then with Cyrenaica, the capital of a 5-city Pentapolis. Alexandria in Egypt, a very important city, although one that Paul never goes to, although we see people come from Alexandria later in chapter 18. And then Cilicia, which is where Paul's from, the city of Tarsus here in the province of Cilicia. And then Asia, where Ephesus is, which is a key echo here because in chapter 19 in Acts, we see that the silversmiths object to Paul and others proclaiming that gods made with hands are not gods, exactly what Stephen will say about the Jerusalem temple in the next chapter. But there, as here, the pious observance of the temple as the home of the god is covering up people's self-interest and profiting off that. So Ephesus is mentioned explicitly, but Asia is mentioned, and this is the place where all the cities of the Revelation are addressed, where also Jerusalem is marginalized and presented as similar to Egypt and Samaria, as not as important a place as wherever Jesus is, which is to say, on the other side of the veil, shining down. So it's consistent that all the New Testament texts will marginalize Jerusalem as the essential center, but here we see this interesting geographic circle of the Eastern Mediterranean here that these people are made a part of. So if they were originally from Italy, which is to say already not here on this map, farther to the west, then why would they be from these places? Would they be from these places and then gone to Italy and then come back to Jerusalem? So the question of the relationship with Italy is not known, nor where they are, but certainly it's likely they're to be in Jerusalem because if they're from all these places, they're not in all those places, and why would people from all those places be in any other one place than probably Jerusalem or perhaps as freedmen in Rome? But they're in Jerusalem now, whether they're visiting or they're long-term, we don't know, and that's the key element here. So Cyrenians, we know from Simon of Cyrene, as my note below has, Cyrene in North Africa also had a large Jewish community, and my reference to Mark is to Cyrene of Cyrene. Cyrene is also associated with Apollo, whose sanctuary can still be seen, and here it is, along with the remains of the rest of Cyrene. It served on and off as the capital of Ptolemaic Egypt, and also of an independent kingdom when the Ptolemies were fighting with the Seleucids on and off. but it was part of the Roman province of Crete and Cyrenaica, and prosperous in the first century until it was destroyed by Jewish fighters in 115 CE during the Diaspora Revolt, which was a follow-up to the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in several provinces. Scholars argue about when Acts was written. Could it have been written as late as knowing about that diaspora revolt? Some scholars suggest maybe, but we don't need to answer that question. Whether he knows about that or not, he certainly knows of the destruction in the year 70, and that these cities would certainly have been on edge because of that. Alexandria, which very interestingly, Paul and folks never go to, but one of the largest centers of Jews anywhere around. Perhaps one of the reasons is Jewish intellectuals there were led by Philo, who was totally Platonized and totally Hellenized, much more so than anybody would have been in Jerusalem, and much more so than Paul, in allegorizing the scriptures and really taking up the Greek culture and just putting a thin Israelite veneer on top of it. He was essential to the so-called church fathers who took the scriptures out of their cultural context and used them for the new religion they invented called Christianity. So Alexandria is an ambiguous place, and it also involved, in the year 38, which certainly Luke knows about, a major disturbance during a visit by Agrippa I, leading to the desecration of the local synagogue. So there was certainly a confrontation between empire and the local Jewish community there. And then we see, and others of, this is slightly over-translating, and literally the Greek simply has, and those from. But some are from Cyrene and Alexandria, but others are from the regions rather than the cities, which is an interesting distinction there. Perhaps to cover over the cities that are at issue. Cilicia to cover over Tarsus, that we'll hear Paul comes from, and then Asia to cover over Ephesus, that we'll hear later. But alert readers would certainly know that. If you say a major city in the United States or a major country in Europe, I say France, you certainly can think of Paris immediately. So they stood up and argued, and literally in the Greek, stood up is the first word for emphasis there. So they all stood up, and they argued with Stephen. And one of the interesting things in these couple of verses, we don't know what they're arguing about. We're only going to be able to infer it from the false witnesses they set up in the verses that follow, and from Stephen's speech. But Luke leaves us in suspense and not know exactly what they're arguing about or why they stood up and argued with him. And this is where I really want to highlight that if we had taken the previous scene about appointing food to make sure the Greek-speaking widows got their food, that wouldn't have any effect on the synagogue of the Freedmen. That required older scholars to see there's some kind of conservative liberal argument going on here, but they're all Hellenists. That Stephen is chosen precisely because he's one of the Hellenists, and these people from outside of Jerusalem are certainly Hellenists in the sense they're part of the wider world that speaks Greek. So it's certainly not Hellenists versus Hebrews, which is the basis for the false theological argument that older German scholars had used in this scene. All I'm going to suggest makes sense from Harrison Mills, and we'll see more of him as we continue through this and in chapter 7, is that they're arguing with him because the appointment of these 7 indicates that the apostles in the community are establishing a separate financial distribution network that's a threat to the temple and to the freedmen who service the Roman elite in relation to the temple. And that's part of the echo we hear also in chapter 19, and we'll hear that more in Stephen's speech. So, in verse 10 we hear, they could not withstand the wisdom and the spirit with which he spoke. As my note below has, no substance of the argument is given. We'll hear something similar in chapter 9, where Saul's superior rhetorical power leads to a similar reaction. The words here, to not withstand, are literally not resist, and we'll see it one more time elsewhere in Acts. That's 11 more times in the New Testament. But fulfilling Luke 21:15, worth going back there to see that, I will give you words into wisdom that none of your opponents will be able to withstand or contradict. Literally being fulfilled right here. Then we see them go into action. And the irony of these 3 verses here, 4 verses, 11 to 15, are tremendous. My note below shows 3 acts: suborning statements about blasphemy against Moses and God, inciting the people, the elders and scribes, to confront, seize, and try Stephen, and then setting up false witnesses about the holy place and the law. And Witherington summarized and critiqued scholarly views that Stephen represents liberal Hellenists versus considered Hebraists, but we don't have to look at any of that now. Keener discusses the normal violence of Roman rhetoric and quotes a 2nd century CE Lucius, quote, effrontery and shamelessness, a prompt lie with an oath to confirm it, always on the edge of your lips, jealousy and hatred of everyone, abuse and plausible slanders, all this will make you famous and distinguished in an instant. I suppose both then and now. And then my note below to 1 Kings notes Jezebel, the wife of Ahab, setting up false witnesses against Elijah. So a deep history of setting up false witnesses against God's prophets. Then they secretly instigated here using hupabalon, but it's literally bribed. Instigated isn't nearly strong enough, not only because bribed is a specific activity, but the irony now that we understand the story is they're using money here to get a false solution to something that's about money. That's how they solve things, by using money. So they buy false witnesses, some men to say, "We have heard him speak blasphemous words against Moses and God." No specific blasphemous words are named here, and we have not heard Stephen speak anything yet. And what we hear in chapter 7 will not be blasphemous against Moses and God at all, but against his opponents. And not blasphemous, except in the most literal sense of blasphemy means insulting. Then they stirred up the people. Sunakennison here, only here in Acts, but we see a similar stirring up in chapter 13. For the first time, the Laos, the people, are revealed in the gospel to be fickle, side with the Sanhedrin, and the tide turns. But it's not just the people, it's specific groups, the elders and the scribes here. Notice not the Sanhedrin as a whole, but these specific groups. We saw elders and scribes earlier, and elders is kind of a generic term, but scribes is not. And the scribes will interestingly be not mentioned again in chapter 23, but let's look back at a very key element of scribes in Luke 20. Beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and love to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces and have the best seats in the synagogues and places of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses, and for the sake of appearance say long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation. And the phrase, of course, devour widows' houses, to say they're financially eating up the wealth of widows. And that only went to what we saw last time, that the widows in this scene does not imply that all widows are poor, but that the scribes are economically devouring widows. And part of the way they can do that is through the very temple system that is being worked around here through this appointment of the seven. So it'd be no surprise that the Synagogue of the Freedmen would see allies in the scribes who are both being threatened by what the apostles have set up here. So they confronted him, suddenly is over-translating here, but they do confront him, and it's almost literally means that they stood near him and seized him, emphasizing the collective nature of the seizure here as a group, and brought him before the council, before the Sanhedrin. And we've only seen the word Sanhedrin as opposed to the implication of the Sanhedrin by naming the elders and the scribes and the rulers, only in Luke 22 when Jesus was brought before it. And that sets up this parallel we see from Keener here between this initial setup of Stephen and the story of Jesus, and we'll see more of that. So plainly, Stephen is being presented through this being brought before the council as it happened to Jesus. He said it'll happen to you, and now it's happening to you as well. So in verse 13, we'll see a parallel of this in chapter 18. They set up false witnesses. The word literally means set up. As Harrison Mills notes, we may infer that the freedmen paid the false witnesses enough money to make it worth their while to commit both perjury and premeditated murder, which in turn means that the removal of Stephen as a possible commercial rival was worth a great deal to this particular group of freedmen bankers and their allies. The word for false witness is two words here, actually. Marturis pseudes is only here in the New Testament, but the verb to bear false witness we saw in Luke, and not surprisingly, and we can go back to look at that too. You know the commandments, you shall not bear false witness, which is exactly what they're doing here. And the irony of they're breaking the commandments while they're charging him with breaking the commandments. And they're suggesting he's doing this continuously, that he never stopped saying things against this holy place. And that's a wonderful irony as well, as we see from Keener below, that matches the wording of Septuagint, quote, that the holy place is the burning bush, which will be quoted in Hack's speech, as well as in the later charge against Paul in chapter 21, and the law. And here's the only time they hear any kind of substance to it, but it's false, as we know. For we've heard him say that this Jesus of Nazareth will destroy this place, which implies that they believe in the resurrection. Talking about something Jesus will do in the future. They certainly must know that Jesus is dead and that his followers are proclaiming him risen, or all this scene wouldn't be happening here. So the idea that that's the false charge is a very interesting, accepting the whole notion of resurrection. And then highlighting this place, which Stephen will adapt in his speech, as you can see, highlighting the same element of holy place in the previous verse. And then another key phrase, will change the customs. Alekai here, only here in the Gospels and Acts, but the key word is customs, ethe here. And as Luke Johnson notes below, by using ethe rather than commandments or laws, Luke, quote, considers the ritual obligations specific to Jews as part of their ancestral heritage, but not necessarily to be taken over by Gentile believers. Thus, the Jews have their customs. But we're going to see it a couple of other times when it's clearly not just about customs in the sense of, I don't know, having turkey on Thanksgiving, but something that binds people together. And in this sense, the one that Moses handed on to us. So yes, it isn't law, but it's a way of practices. One could certainly translate that simply as practices, because the fact that Moses handed them on means they've come from God. So these are the charges, and then suddenly there's a coda. And all who sat in the council looked intently at him. Tenesos here, a Lucan word of 14 times in the New Testament. It's only 2 times outside of Luke Acts, and it has to do with looking intently, and we see it all these times in Acts. And when they look at him intently, they see something that's never described elsewhere, and we can't even describe it now. His face was like the face of an angel, whatever that looks like. And perhaps you're picturing translucence or cherubs or Renaissance art, but those images are very different. Perhaps the image of an angel means it's glowing in some way or revelatory, but we don't know what that is. As Keener notes below, Luke thus ironically reverses the accusation that Stephen opposes Moses. Instead, Stephen follows the pattern of Moses, whose face is like an angel. As Willie Jennings notes, Stephen in fact looks out of the Sanhedrin from inside a reality that has captured them, but they refuse to see it. We read this text poorly if we read it like a theological jigsaw puzzle or a historical recitation, or even Luke proving a point. It may be all of those things, but it is first a performance. It is a storyteller at work inviting his friends to move from death to life. Will they accept the invitation from death to life? We'll see beginning next time. See you then.